Do we have an obligation to obey the law? If the government puts up a stop sign on the corner of First and Main, do we have an obligation to stop? Even if we know we can ignore the sign without getting caught, is there an obligation to stop? In the previous video, I looked at Dworkin's thesis that the obligation to obey the law is linked to the authority to make law. If you think that there is no obligation to obey the law, then you must think that there's no legitimate authority to create law, since the authority to create laws is the authority to create things others have an obligation to obey. So if the government can't create an obligation to stop on the corner of First and Main, then the government can't legitimately put a stop sign there. But if the government can legitimately put a stop sign on the corner of First and Main, then the government can create and enforce an obligation to stop. In this video, I'm going to look at Dworkin's answer to both puzzles, the puzzle of political obligation and the puzzle of legitimate authority. For Dworkin, both the legitimacy of making the law and the obligation to obey the law come about because of the powers and obligations that are inherent in political associations. According to Dworkin, associations create obligations. Political associations create obligations to obey the rules set down by the association. So let's start with a simple case, a club or a team. A group of people form a club. We're all in this together, and we're going to work together. Having an association means there's going to be a set of norms and practices for the making of rules that are binding on the whole group. Everybody in the club has an obligation to follow the rules of the club, and the club has a right to create and enforce its rules on its members. However, in the case of political association, there's a problem with this analogy. These types of associations, clubs and teams, involve consent. People join the group, and they can leave the group. Yet Dworkin admits that there's no point at which people explicitly join a nation, nor can they leave a nation. Barry writes, quote, "It is never the case that everyone subject to any given legal system has validly consented to obey it," unquote. Yet there is a point at which each member joined a club or a team, so the analogy is, let's say, incomplete. Dworkin answers this problem by pointing out that there are associations that we are members of, associations that come with obligations, but associations that we do not consent to join. We just find ourselves in these associations. One of these is the association of friendship. In some cases, two people might have a conversation in which one person says, "Hey, let's be friends," and another says, "Sure," in which case friendship is entered into by mutual consent. But in most cases, this isn't the way friendships form. Two people spend time together, they enjoy each other's company, and over time, they realize that even without thinking about it, they have become friends. And friendship comes with certain obligations. You aren't a very good friend if you never help your friend with anything, if you don't keep their secrets, if there isn't this implicit, never expressed background fact that if you ever need anything, you can count on me. Another type of association that Dworkin mentions that people find themselves in without their consent is the association of the family. Very few of us choose our parents or guardians. We don't choose our siblings. We simply find ourselves in these associations. But these associations still come with duties. Children have a duty to obey their parents or guardians, so long as those parents or guardians aren't abusive. By analogy, citizens have an obligation to obey the government, so long as the government is not abusive. And parents have certain obligations with respect to how they treat their children, just as governments have certain obligations to their citizens. Given this notion that the obligation to obey the law only applies to the laws created legitimately, Dworkin questions the obligation to obey the law in cases like Jews and others in Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, American slaves and segregated blacks, and people living in the former Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin. Now, the next question. What can we say about these associations that create obligations? Associations like friendship and family, and, as Dworkin will argue, political associations. Dworkin identifies four important features. With respect to associations that involve obligations, Dworkin states that, quote, "First, they must regard the group's responsibilities as special, holding distinctly within the group rather than as general duties its members owe equally to persons outside of it, end quote. A child doesn't, and in fact shouldn't, give every adult the same duty of obedience that they give to their parents or guardian, and a friend doesn't treat a friend exactly the same way they would treat everybody else, non-friends. This just goes against the very idea of friendship. Dworkin continues, quote, "Second, they must accept that these responsibilities are personal and that they run directly from each member to each other member, not just to the group as a whole in some collective sense." End quote. So if you have a friend, you have a special relationship with that person. Your sister is a particular person. The obligations that Dworkin talks about are obligations to specific individuals, not to the state or the group or the family or to the idea of friendship. You need not owe the group anything, but you owe it to each of the other members of the group to do your share. Next, quote, "Third, members must see these responsibilities as flowing from a more general responsibility each has of concern for the well-being of others in the group." End quote. So ultimately, when we talk about your duties to your friends or family members, it springs from a general concern about how they're doing. What do you need? How can I help? Again, abusive relationships don't create obligations. There's no right to abuse a friend or family member or duty to accept that abuse. And fourth, quote, "Members must suppose that the group's practices show not only concern, but equal concern for all members." End quote. This fourth criteria, equality, is a part of Dworkin's concept of justice. There may be leaders and followers, people who accept certain positions in the relationship, but these systems have their legitimacy because they are a way of promoting an equal concern for everybody in the group. Corporations are not associations in this sense. They're associations, but a different type of association. To put the profit of the owners above the well-being of the workers would go counter to this principle of equality. So when one finds oneself in an association with these functions, they come with a set of obligations and duties. Political associations, according to Dworkin, is an association of this type. Political associations come with duties to obey the law. But are political associations really associations of this type? Perry has some problems with this idea. Now, the reason that this question is important is because Dworkin argues that political associations are associations of a particular type. Associations of a particular type contain obligations. Therefore, political associations contain obligations. If political associations are not associations of the relevant type, there may be trouble inferring that they imply these obligations. One objection that Perry raises to the claim that political associations are associations of the relevant type is that political associations do not seem to be personal in the relevant sense. Perry writes, quote, "If a general political obligation ever exists, it is far from clear that it's personal. In form, at least, it's not. The general obligation to obey the law is usually thought to be owed, if to anyone, to the community or state itself rather than to one's fellow citizens, considered one by one." End quote. According to Perry, Dworkin answers this objection by personifying the group, treating the group as a person, and that, in Dworkin's words, quote, "It commands that no one be left out, that we are all in politics for better or worse, that no one may be sacrificed like wounded left on the battlefield to the crusade for justice over all." End quote. But this, according to Perry, is more relevant to the fourth criteria of equality than with the second criteria of person-to-person or member-to-member obligations. And then, on the matter of this fourth criteria, Perry challenges the claim that there is an equality of concern in these associative relationships. He looks at the family and notices that the duties and concerns of the parent are different from the duties and concerns of the child. The parent has an obligation to care for the child, but the child has a duty to obey the parent. Perry writes, quote, "To make this clear, imagine the case of a single parent raising a single child. The parent has an obligation to care for the child, and associated with this obligation is a power to command obedience. The child has an obligation to do as the parent requires. These two obligations, the obligation on the part of the parent to care for the child and the obligation on the part of the child to obey the parent are not reciprocal obligations like those that hold between two friends." End quote. Even when it comes to the association of friendship, people do not treat all of their various friends the same. Some friendships are closer than others, and the obligations correspondingly stronger. Perry wrote, quote, "We do not, for example, owe the same level of concern for all of our various friends. And that's true even within a group of mutual friends. The appropriate level of concern varies with the closeness of the particular friendship." End quote. A third question that Perry raises with respect to these different associations is whether these four criteria are exhaustive of those that are responsible for creating obligations. Perry asks, quote, "Relatedly, how can we be sure that other features that seem to be essential to the paradigm cases of friendship and family, for example, true emotional bonds of love, affection, or respect, are not essential features of associative obligations in general, thereby ruling out such associations as political community?" End quote. After presenting these issues, Perry summarized, quote, "The main point I was concerned to establish in the last paragraph is that there does not seem to be a single conception of equal concern that informs even the paradigmatic associative relationships of family and friendship." End quote. So once again, the point of Perry's objections is this. Dworkin argues that there are certain associations that we do not enter into as a matter of consent, but still contain obligations. Political associations are associations of this type. Therefore, political associations have obligations, specifically the obligation to obey the law. To make his argument work, Dworkin must argue that political associations are a type of association that creates obligations. Against this, Perry argues that Dworkin has failed to provide us with a unified account of a general type of association that creates obligations. Remember, we're asking whether a government putting up a stop sign on the corner of First and Main can create an obligation for us to stop. Dworkin argues that a political association is an association of the type that creates obligations, including an obligation to stop if the association puts up a stop sign. This, Perry will argue, might make sense, but Dworkin needs to do a better job defending the thesis that a political association is an association of the right type. Now, Perry thinks that he can improve on Dworkin. Interestingly enough, he thinks he can improve on Dworkin using ideas that come from Dworkin. And that's where we're going to turn our attention to next.